Hello everyone and welcome to day 2, and let's get started. This is a quick keynote, but we'll see where we go. So let's address the obvious question here. Why is a threat intel guy at your conference? And how the hell did he get a keynote slot when there's all these actual real exploit guys that didn't get a keynote slot? So I used to be a offensive security. Before coming to Google 12 years ago, I'd never actually worked defense. I used to really enjoy the work. I used to do the exploits, though I'm getting pretty out of date now. I think the last exploit I did actually did have jump ESP in it. But somewhere along the line, I got kind of, through a series of events, ended up actually running a threat intelligence team. And now what I do for a living, and my team does, is actually track and counter serious threats, and I occasionally tweet and blog about them and all that stuff. So again, why am I here at OffensiveCon? So I think it has something to do with some of our more recent work. So Mark, in an interview, was actually talking about how, vendors have amazing detections, but also groups like Google Tag, my team, actually is able to rumble offensive players, and being stealthy in 2021 is hard. So my world is obviously intersecting with your world in some ways, and that's probably why you got out of bed to come and listen to my talk. So the keynote many of you may actually want is, okay, here is exactly how Tag catches all your stuff, and here's how to avoid it. Sorry, I'm not that nice to you all, but I'm going to give you a different talk instead, and maybe a little bit of that, but the talk you're going to get is, what is the offensive security researcher's place in this wider threat landscape? Because that's what I discovered going into looking at sort of more geopolitical threat actors. I do think, you're part of this. So you can skip out if you're expecting the other talk. I won't be offended. So I kind of joke a bit about that everybody has their own view of the security community and the whole security world. And when you talk to somebody, you get their biases. Everybody thinks that they're the center of their own story, right? So this is my sort of tongue-in-cheek sort of understanding of how a vuln researcher sees the world. Is 0 days, that's probably at least 75% of everything that's important. Then there's giving cool names and logos to 0 days. Then there's arguing about disclosure. And then probably maybe 5% of the rest of anything that matters in security. It's all that other boring stuff, right? Not exactly, right? I don't think anybody actually believes that, but I do think there is a bias towards what you're interested in, bias towards what you're working on. And so it can be overstated. Most of the threats we look at actually aren't 0 days. And just to show that I'm fair, I can actually say that threat intel people are equally as biased, that they are all about making guesses about attribution and giving cool names and logos to threat actors instead of exploits, but otherwise we're actually relatively similar. Everybody's biased towards their own world. So I do think there is actually something fairly special about exploitation, though, and that's something why it interests me so much and why we put some resources into it. So this is an XKCD comic that's been going around for a while, but especially kind of created because of Log4j, showing that all the modern digital infrastructure can be supported by some really small amount of maybe an open source project. So my variation of this in sort of my mental model is, and what I see is there may be this major hacking operation against democracy activists, and that may be propped up by just one 0 day that's come out of some researcher, right? And that they sold it to NSO. So there is these sort of small critical pieces in what could be a really big operation that covers infrastructure, malware, and social engineering, and phishing, and geopolitics. But a lot of this can be propped up by some of this very technical, small amounts of work, which sort of interacts with the nature of this conference. Before I move on, though, I'd like to say that there is actually more similarities between offensive research and threat intel than I originally thought, as somebody who's made this transition. You think about security in general, we actually have a world where everybody has an opinion, especially in the days of cyber at the moment. We have all these thought leaders, we have all these vendors, we have everybody who has an opinion on what matters in security. They all have an opinion that their product's going to save the world. But there's actually some lack of hard truth at times, and actually lack of ground truth. And I think both offensive security gives you ground truth because, if you can pop calc or pop shell, you are proving that this thing is exploitable and vulnerable. There's no arguments about it. Similarly, in my threat intel world, if I actually show a foreign government or a cybercrime actor actually succeeding in exploitation and the details of it, then that is to me a lot more valuable than all this theoretical. Theoretically, an attacker could do this, and if I was the Russian government, I would do that. I can actually rock up to the meetings going, well, actually, this is what the Russian government did last week, and that actually sort of wins the debate and allows us to focus on what matters. So I think I like both areas because they have that sense of reality. So why should you care about this threat world, right? Like, I miss doing sort of vuln research and offensive security because you get to have these cool technical problems and very pure problems in times if you do it. Like, there's no arguing, there's none of this sort of like, shades of gray sometimes. You're either succeeding or not. So you may ask, like, why should you care? And the answer is that I'm going to try and convince you in the rest of this talk, is that this whole threat world is a game, right? It's like, in some ways, the grand game of geopolitics and many other games. And you may be in this game already. And there's a saying in poker that if you sit in on a poker game and you don't see the sucker, then get up because you're the sucker. So maybe in the next 20 minutes or so, I can give you a few things to watch out for to make sure that if you are in this game, that you're not the sucker in the game at least, and that would be a win for me. So the first way that offensive security people are becoming more and more into this game is that attackers, and by attackers I actually mean government-backed attackers like North Korea, are actually directly targeting researchers. So suddenly the research people are on the front line. So we published on this last year. We actually published quite a number of details about this targeting by the North Koreans towards security research and exploit developers. And the way they did this primarily was actually targeting this community, right? And the way that this community of offensive researchers work, right? They created the Twitter accounts and to kind of build their profile. They created a blog which kind of made them look like they were doing some security research. And then they actually reached out to people, and I think actually pretty sure literally people in this room saying that, oh yeah, I've got this 0 day, I'm pretty sure it's a 0 day, but I haven't quite got it working yet. Can you help me out? Can you take a look? And some people bid at that, right? And so at that stage, they actually pulled up this, they actually provided some Visual Studio files or some project files or whatever. And it wasn't a super sophisticated exploit for this part. They actually just had PowerShell commands in the Visual Studio file, and they're able to get some very established and great security researchers by just getting them to run the Visual Studio file. So more concerning, though, is that there was actually evidence that it did go beyond this, that they actually had succeeded, and they actually did have a full chain exploit against Chrome and Windows 10. And we were never able to actually get a hold of the actual exploit, but there's a lot of good evidence they did have it. And if I was betting, I was saying they probably didn't build that themselves, but they may have actually succeeded in a previous campaign against some of these, people developing exploits for high-end sort of government work, and then they were actually repurposing it for this work. And that's really scary, right? This is really like proliferation. So be safe out there all. There's two very quick follow-ups on this though. It's like after they got taken down and then they came back, when they came back, they had to rebuild up their stuff and they had to come new content. And the new content was to start tweeting about how great tag is. So these are actually tweets by North Korean threat actors talking about my team. And then they're even retweeting me and job ads for my team. And I would not have predicted a year before this that I'd have North Korean followers actually helping me drum up sort of press and hiring, and they're doing this. Even more weirdly, and I haven't gone too much into this was actually only 2 days ago in Wired. One of the people that was hacked by this now is actually saying that they're engaging in automated exploitation and hacking back and taking North Korea off the internet. I don't know what to make of this, but definitely a sign that makes my point that people are in this game and it is a game and security researchers are part of it. What's the second way? Not only is North Korea targeting you, we are targeting you too. And by we, I don't just mean Google Tag, Project Zero, I mean generally defenders are targeting 0 days specifically. So my team had a good year last year doing this, maybe a bad year for the people whose exploits got burnt here, but this is 11 0-day that were discovered actively in use by the wild by threat actors that we reported and got patched. And this is only actually, a small part of the overall picture. Matty Stone and Project Zero are tracking all the publicly released 0 days in the wild, and it was 57 last year. And this is growing, and that was a new record. And I think Matty's talking later today on that. So why do we do this to you? Is it just because we're mean and we just want to like mess with you all? Or is it because we're not patriotic and we don't understand how offensive security is like the greatest thing ever and we're just terrible people? No, I don't think so, right? Firstly, we do it because it's fun. Like, it is so much more fun looking at new 0 days than looking at new phishing messages. So I do like we do a little bit of this stuff. But kind of as I said with that kind of cartoon earlier, like I do think 0 days are fairly critical to this work, right? Like, if you think of all the other ways that we see people exploited day by day with like phishing, with malware, social engineering, there's other things we can do there, right? We can do awareness, we can do security keys, we can do patching, we can fix almost everything else. But like if you start having attacks which are, 0 days, there's only so much you can do around that. So I think it does deserve a little bit more resources than other things. I always try and think of like, how can we actually hold back adversaries in general? And part of that is like thinking through the constrained resources. And if you think of all the resources they need for their attacks, I think they can always find a new software engineer to kind of build the malware, right? They can just keep hiring those people. I think they're always going to be able to find boxes on the internet. They're always going to be able to find email accounts. I think one of their most constrained resources for an attacker is actually 0 day. So if we actually want to sort of constrain attackers, that might be one of the areas to focus. And that's my hypothesis as we go into this, that hunting 0 day and getting it patched will lead to overall better security. So being OffensiveCon though, I thought I'd actually better have a side note of like, why do I actually believe that security is a good thing? At almost any other conference I wouldn't, but I thought like, I at least want to defend why free-for-all hacking is not the best thing in the world. So bias, of course, like, unlike in past days, now I actually get paid to make things more secure, and insecurity is bad for my employer's business, so that's part of it. But more generally, I do believe that, a more secure world on the whole is a better world. I'm like a sci-fi geek growing up as a kid, right? I believe in all this like cool technological future. I want to see us go to space. I want to see advances in medicine. I want to see advances in finance. I want to see really cool technological advancements of the human race. And I have this, fear in the back of my mind now that so much of what the human race needs to achieve actually is sitting on top of this digital infrastructure and the internet. And if it's not at all secure and we can't secure it even a little bit, then that actually really could hold back some really important things. I'm already starting to see that with like ransomware hitting healthcare in a pandemic and many other things that like total insecurity is not great. So I'm not naive though. I'm not like a black and white person, right? I'm not saying that like, everything is always one way or the other, but I do think the balance has shifted, and I'm definitely seeing evidence that balance has shifted, that attacks are too easy, even for actors, like North Korea, which are very unpredictable. If attacks are really easy for them, that's not a good sign for the world. And another good sign, I think the really good example is, forced entry exploit against iOS, like last year, right? This was an exploit that was there for multiple months, 0 click, 0 interaction against iOS devices from an actor that was, supplying to many countries who seem to be doing very irresponsible things. And I don't think this is a really good world where like many actors are running around with this capability, and that like everybody just has to assume that these phones, which, people live their lives on these phones, and it becomes like an out, part of their sort of like world and brain, like a second brain, and suddenly that's like exposed to anybody who can like pony up some money to a commercial surveillance vendor. So I can justify why I'm pushing back on this a little bit here. Second one is, I mentioned this a little bit too, incentives matter, right? So we're not about just fighting back the individual bits and pieces, fighting back individual bugs. I think we also need to think about how to shift the incentives across the industry, across the world, to actually lead to better outcomes. And one of the ways, an example of this, is that we, quite a number of years ago, Google, changed the policy that, we don't give 90 days deadline if we discover a 0 day actively being used in the wild against people, right? You now get 7 days before we're going to release the details and patch. And this led to a lot of pushback, a lot of like wailing and gnashing of teeth. But like it really has shifted the industry, right? Like last year we got this great response from Apple. Like Clem and my team found this exploit being used in the wild. We reported Apple, and then like within 7 days, a new release of iOS was released and being pushed to all users, and users were being protected from that. And this is a great win, and I think it's sort of like the virtuous cycle that comes from the creating the right incentives for the right things to happen. So coming back to the main part of my talk off these side notes now, is all this, it sounds great, right? But is this actually working? Am I actually having an effect on this world? Are other people finding 0 days having effects? If you count the number of 0 days, no, we're at a record, but is that because we're finding them more? I'll let other people debate that. I do think there is some hope. I think we've got people's attention, right? Like the fact that I'm standing here on this stage at OffensiveCon actually means that somebody's taking some notice and some interest, and we're having some effect somewhere, or at least we're interested. I think it is raising the skill bar, and I think that's, even if we only do that, I think it is a good thing. Even if we just make it so the people with good 0 days don't leak them out everywhere, that in its own right would be a good thing, because at least then only the people who develop them would have them, as opposed to everybody else who finds them lying around the internet. But I do think we can actually raise the skill bar here. I don't think we'll ever eliminate 0 days from the world, but I think we can make it harder than we do today. I do think this work is just getting started. I don't think we're going to do a little bit more on this, but again, it's a small part of my world. But I do think more people are going to do this. I think more people should do this. I think this is exciting. And I think there's a lot of exciting, real technical, interesting problems in this. So if you do want to think about a bit of a shift and try and work out how to do this, I think it's a great green field. So go Team Blue. So now we get into the less technical sides of this, but just as important, I think. The other way that you can get in the game, and in the game in a very bad way, is when accountability comes knocking for work in the offensive security world. And we're seeing more of this, right? Of people getting caught out because they've crossed a line, and in some ways because the line's moved. We have here the, this is dark matter. So this is a bunch of, ex-US intelligence operatives that ended up working for a company in UAE and supplying UAE with capabilities and allegedly doing hacking. And on the right is, the actual, technical term, indictments or charge sheets or whatever, where they the federal charges for export regulations and for criminal acts, right? So this is a fairly egregious case, but the thing to think about is that there is a whole continuum here, and where you sit on this continuum is something to really think about. And I think we're seeing across the board things that would not have been getting attention now, and that consequences could be coming, and you should look forward. Also, at company levels, there's a lot of drama at the moment from US sanctions, and this causing the actual business of NSO to really struggle at the moment. So thinking about that coming from very high levels. I don't think it's just US either. This is an example from EU are doing special commissions and recommending sanctions and other actions coming out of Europe as well. So this is not just a US thing. And why is this happening? And I think part of the reason this is happening too is that some of these commercial offensive players are somewhat getting out of control, right? It was kind of reasonable a few years ago when everyone was sort of claiming, no, the only way any of this offensive research is being used is to track terrorists and save lives. But when week after week it's sort of exposed that no, it's democracy activists, no, it's journalists, no, it's people targeting their political opposition in democracies, it becomes a lot harder, and then it's getting a lot more attention from the people who want to do something about it. So as sort of manager guy, I end up doing a lot of meetings with government people on different topics and threats, and these commercial vendors and policy people really all know about these actors and are really thinking about this problem a lot at the moment, so I expect a lot of evolution in this space. I also think just the general pressure from, the books about the zero-day market, the, effects of ransomware, just everything that's happening in the world, 10 years ago, you talk to a politician and they wouldn't have any opinion on hacking whatsoever. Now you're seeing stuff coming out of the White House or whatever that, software supply chain and open source patching and commercial surveillance vendors are actually like quite up the agenda out of like top politicians and legislative agendas. So that's something that is new and continuing. So I think the norms are going to change. So I'd keep an eye on it, right? Just like because something was like, it was totally cool to do in 2010 or 2020, like, will it still be cool in 2025 when they change the rules? Watch out for that. And I think individuals should look at their own risk as well, depending on like who you're working for and what you're doing. Like you should be looking at like, okay, you can't just trust that your employer is a great guy or girl, and you have to think about, okay, am I going to face any legal risk? Am I going to be the sucker at the table here? Like, and also, as things change, like, and as things more get outed, what's the reputational risk to you too, right? Like, how is some of these things going to look on your resume, even if you do claim that, oh no, I was just sitting behind, IDA Pro doing this work. Like the last point is like, that ignorance and naivety is becoming less of an excuse, right? So the people are sort of expecting people to think about what they're doing here. So the last bit of this is just thinking about how like, 0 days and offensive capability is a strategic asset, right? It's, intentions in the world now, like, I am not a big like, cyber war guy, whatever, but it is, undeniable that sort of like, cyber operations or hacking operations or whatever you want to call them actually are becoming a part of geopolitical conflict. It is becoming a part of geopolitical espionage, actually has been for a long time. So these things actually really matter, and these capabilities are starting to be strategic capabilities like other military capabilities are. And if it's not totally obvious, like you can also just like infer that this is changing by how certain countries are treating this work, right? Like, a couple of years ago, you'd go to Pwn to Own and there'd be like all these amazing Chinese researchers there, sort of like running the board, getting their exploits out there. But then those exploits, through Pwn to Own or whatever, would actually go to the vendors and they get patched. And then suddenly a couple of years ago, none of the Chinese researchers can now go. And now it's like Tianfu Cup, where they're still going after all the same targets, which happen to be things that are really good strategic for Chinese to have hacking capability against. And those exploits aren't necessarily coming to the vendors after all, right? So, they're not dumb here, right? They know the value of these things, and they're creating, again, the incentives to actually make it work and to make it work in their favor. And then, and they're still being super successful, right? Like this is like a partial list of what just came out of one Tianfu Cup. And there's kind of somewhat real consequences too. Like another example from just this year or end of last year is the like Log4j exploit found by Alibaba Cloud. They actually did, what I would say, and I think most people would say is the right thing, of actually reporting this to the sort of maintainers to get patched. But then they're actually, suffering sort of at least, some pushback and pull of support from the Chinese government because they actually got this critical infrastructure patched as opposed to, telling them about it. So it's definitely a warning shot of what they should do next time from these security researchers. So what am I saying here is the like, I'm trying to like inflate your egos a little bit here too, of the like, the work you do here actually can have really big influence. So this wouldn't be a keynote if I think it's like when I read my sort of keynote manual, they say you're meant to come up with like a bunch of predictions that you can't, which are probably wrong and that I can't back up. But it is the rules, so I'm going to give you a couple of predictions here about where I think all of this is going. And hopefully I've proven most of these already, right? So prediction one is that I think it is going to get harder to use 0 day without getting caught, right? Like I don't think people were actively hunting and looking and detecting as much as they were. I think people are going to continue to do that. It's going to be good. It's going to act as a nice limiting force and balancing force. So I think that's something to be prepared for. That, it's not just a matter of getting past the automatic mitigations these days or finding that combination of exploit chain to get execution, that actually working out how to run the gauntlet of being detected in the process by either the platforms or some other mechanism will actually become a more important part of being a threat actor. Cover this, that I do think the legal and geopolitical pressure on offensive tech will increase. Not necessarily in a good way either, right? Like, I'm like, whenever whenever I see, like, whenever politics gets involved, and whether I see legislators like passing laws or whatever, like, I wouldn't guarantee that it's all going to be good laws, right, or well-written laws. I think there is actually, it's going to be a different world and a changing world, but we have to be prepared for anything here, and prepared for crypto wars too, or laws that may have unintended consequences. But this isn't going away anytime soon, given the high priority at present. Didn't cover this a lot, but I do think we are seeing like a reinvestment a bit more in secure systems, both on the technical side of like some mitigations coming through, but also just on the prioritization of making things secure, right? Like, I think there's been like some real big lessons learned on sort of big hacks and ransomware and everything else, and open source and the SolarWinds hack, that the governments and others are doing a good job actually of making the incentives a bit more towards that. Having a secure system is going to cause you less problems in the long term, and that's going to create more opportunities for investment for people to make things more secure. My last prediction is that, like, I would not be worried that technical challenges and interesting technical work is going away anytime soon. I think there is plenty of opportunities to kind of, the technology is only going to get better and more fun. And I noticed that today. I still dabble in this stuff on the weekend, looking at like probably beginner CTFs these days, and like, it's amazing what is happening in this community, and I've really enjoyed watching the talks here, and I enjoy watching how this technology evolves. So I will get off the stage very quickly and then hand over to actual, people doing serious technical work and really exciting exploit stuff. But I suppose my closing sort of like thought on this is, I'm not here, like, is to just, hopefully I've just given you this taste to think about this world, right? To think about, just in a little bit about where you fit in, and maybe I'm kind of asking you to think about that as you go forward as well. Like, many of the people here and in this world, your work could have a real effect in different ways on yourself, on individuals, on governments, or the world. That sort of like where the sort of like the brains and power is applied can make a difference in different directions, maybe more than you think. So I'm not here to say like do one thing versus the other thing, make all these judgments and to admonish anyone in particular. But I do think, with great power comes great responsibility, that you do have choices, right? If you're a great exploit researcher, developer, you could apply it in a bunch of different ways, right? You could go work for someone like Dark Matter. You could go work for your national government. You could go work for, Project Zero and get things patched, or you could work on mitigations in Intel. There's a whole bunch of different ways you could attack this problem. So I'm just asking you to like think about it and make sure you make the decisions that you're comfortable with, and the decisions that like you think is doing better for yourself and everyone else, and not just to be that naive sucker at the table that doesn't think about what they're doing. So that's it from me. Thank you all, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to you all. And yeah, follow me on Twitter and argue with me on Twitter, or catch me around the conference. Thank you.